Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Halifax, Canada for the annual Halifax International Security Forum, one of the world's truly great security conferences here in this great town. Our coverage here is sponsored by Boeing and Leonardo DRS, and it's our honor to have with us Seth Moulton, former United States Marine captain who is now a member of the United States Congress from the great state of Massachusetts, former presidential candidate who I'm sure will be have another crack on that in the future, and Jim Banks, Republican member from the great state of Indiana and a lieutenant in the United States Navy Reserve. For anybody there who doesn't know this, they were both of equal rank, so it's not like, you know, we were talking about that earlier. So let me talk to you guys about this task force, which is really great. You know, there were folks for a long time who've been talking about, hey, look, let's have a strategic view to frame some of these big issues. Sir, let me start with you. You know, talk to us about the importance of this effort and some of the foundational elements that you guys are bringing into this, because you're also on a very tight timetable of 6 months, if I'm right.
Yeah, that's right. I give a lot of credit to Chairman Adam Smith and Ranking Member Thornberry of the House Armed Services Committee. Seth and I spend so much time in committee hearings that go by really quickly, that focus on the issues of the moment. But Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Thornberry said, let's take a deeper dive and look at the future of warfare, what it's going to take to confront the enemies that we face in the future, maybe first and foremost being the China threat. So this task force gives us an opportunity to go deeper than what we get to usually do in a traditional committee hearing format.
Son?
Jim's exactly right. And we're going to ask some tough questions that we don't always get to think about when we're just focused on how do we fund the military for the next 12 months. We're going to ask what kinds of investments do we need to be making to meet the threat 30 years from now? Maybe what kinds of weapons programs do we need to consider cutting? But more holistically, how can we set up the Department of Defense to better address these issues and lean into the future more in their day-to-day operations?
How do you tackle the issue of what's not needed and where we put the investment? Because ultimately we do what we do because we do it, right? As opposed to asking, well, wait a minute, at a fundamental level, are any of the systems we're buying, for example, applicable to the kind of great power competition or properly equipped, you know, in your case, whether it was in Afghanistan, the right way for that kind of conflict, right, which we didn't seem to get right in the beginning when this was going on. How do you address some of these political challenges, because members have stuff that's built in their districts and they're the last people in the world that want to see it go away? Well,
that gets to the heart of what we're trying to do. Sometimes it takes sacrificing sacred cows to focus on the types of innovation that we need to prepare for the future. And that's what we're learning. We're only 1 month into this endeavor. We have a 6-month expiration date. And we're learning about some of the attitudes or some of the culture at the Pentagon that inhibits or prevents the type of innovation base that we need to prepare for the future. So we have a number of hearings coming up, a number of roundtable discussions. We've heard from RAND Corporation. We had a first committee hearing with Michelle Flournoy and Senator Jim Talent that set the tone for the type of risk and investment that the Pentagon should be making. That's the big picture that we're trying to get to the heart of.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because as we've gotten just into the first month of this this task force, we've realized that it's not just enough to ask what are the sacred cows we need to cut. We need to ask, how are there sacred cows in the first place? Why do we have a culture in the DoD, arguably in Congress as well, that just allows the perpetuation of old systems that may very well be out of date at a time when our adversaries are trying to leapfrog us? You know, Russia and China aren't just trying to compete on the same playing field we are, build just as many aircraft carriers and make them a little bit stronger. They're trying to just leapfrog our technologies, and that's the new world that we find ourselves in across the globe.
Let me follow up one thing and start with you on this one, because you've spoken about this often. It doesn't matter how good the national defense strategy is. We have an exceptional national defense strategy. The question is whether or not there's a national strategy that brings all the other arms of national power to bear, whether it's economic or diplomatic. And that disconnect, I know what H.R. McMaster was trying to achieve, and it was totally right to try to get this integrated picture, but there are those folks who say that an unruly president who's launching trade wars on allies actually is very, very disruptive to trying to achieve that kind of a strategic, holistic vision. So it's a little bit like having the best run engine room on the Titanic. At the end of the day, if you're hitting icebergs, it's not going to stay afloat all that long. how do we need to think about this piece in the context of a far broader, China has an artificial intelligence strategy. I'm not saying that we should be mimicking what the Chinese are doing. How do we need to think about that big holistic picture that you actually have talked about? I mean, you and I were at the Reagan Forum a couple of years ago and you talked about the single most important thing that we were not doing.
Well, not to belabor your analogy, but we are in Halifax, and the Titanic's a big part of history here. And
well played, sir.
Well, you could certainly say that the disaster would not have happened if the captain had made better decisions. It was really a systemic failure on board the ship. A lot of things went wrong that contributed to that disaster. So the president's not helping, perhaps, but the reality is that we've got to have a system that works holistically, regardless of who is sitting in the Oval Office. And we used to have that. I mean, we used to have that. That's how we competed so well throughout the Cold War. No one thinks that the U.S. military alone won the Cold War. But right now, China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, seems to be setting the pace. And we obviously need to do a lot to catch up.
The president indeed has been a disruptive force, but some of that disruption is healthy. I mean, I happen to believe that what the Pentagon needs is a fair amount of disruption in the culture that prevents the type of innovation to develop the type of autonomy or autonomous weapons systems that we need for the future. Maybe to create the culture that will develop the next weapons system or the next technology that's going to help us to confront China, for example, in a new way. So I think that disruption can be healthy, and I think our task force moving forward can get to dig into that even deeper.
Two more questions. First, House and Senate overwhelmingly passed the Hong Kong measure the president has suggested, although I don't know what by the time this airs what the situation will be. Does it really matter if he signs it at this point? I mean, doesn't it have the force of law effectively when it passes unanimously in the Senate? And I think there was only one vote in the House, right? Wasn't it 417 to 1?
That's right. There's only one member of Congress in the House or the Senate who voted no, so this would be easy to override a veto. But I really don't believe, in spite of what President Trump said today, I really don't believe he'll veto it. I believe he'll sign it. It's the right thing to do. The U.S. stands with freedom lovers in Hong Kong, and the Congress's broad support in bipartisan fashion shows that type of support that we share with the people of Hong Kong.
Well, I agree with what my colleague just said. I think Jim's right. I hope he's right about the president. There's no question that we need to stand united on this principle as Americans, because it's foundational to who we are.
Let me ask one other question. Well, wait a minute. One follow-up on the task force. When it comes to the task force, so do you guys have some form of aggressive schedule and a rough idea of what it is you guys want to recommend at the very end of this? I mean, is it sort of shaping up in terms of where you think the muscle movements are going to be? Where do you think the major trade-offs are going to be?
I mean, we're working on it, but we don't want to presuppose results. And I think one of the features of just the first month is that we are changing our approach day by day, just as we learn more and refine exactly what the right questions are that we have to ask here.
We don't have a lot of time, but we have a long ways to go. We're only a month into this, and we've Seth and I have worked hard to set the tone for how we develop the type of report that we want to end up with at the end of the day. But I don't think either one of us have a clear idea what that's going to look like.
Let me ask you one. You both have military experience. There's a lot of concern in military circles, in part because of some of the decisions the president has made. For example, the Gallagher case with the SEAL who was accused of war crimes. I know on stuff like this, the Navy works very hard not to bring charges unless there's a reason to bring charges. It goes through a judicial process. The president circumvented that. And I know military friends of mine who even supported the president are beginning to feel increasingly uneasy, for example, turning on Colonel Vindman, for example, or in this particular case when the Navy says, well, there's a process that we have to go through. The community has to go through a process about whether or not that person remains a SEAL, for example, or maintains his Trident, or remains an E7, which was a Chief Petty Officer. I know that there are some things the Navy may have stuck a finger in the eye of the president ultimately, but what are the messages that are being sent here to men and women who are wearing the uniform, who expect it to be depoliticized and they serve no matter who's in office?
Well, it does make me uneasy when anyone intervenes into these cases. So Eddie Gallagher, for example, is from my district, and I reviewed that case thoroughly. I thought there were reasons that it should be reviewed, called on the president to take an interest, and he did. But he's also taken an interest in a handful of other cases too. So I can't judge why the president made the determinations that he did. I can only assume that he was advised by some of his chief advisors from the Pentagon and in the military in making those cases. But at this point, I don't know enough about that to comment further.
I mean, my concern is that he was not following the advice of folks in the Pentagon, because what I've heard from the military across the board is really serious concern. And you know, there's a great op-ed written in the Post today, excuse me, by Joe Crystal, who's a fellow Marine veteran, and Stephen Petraeus. So you know, two people who are great veterans, perhaps better known now by their fathers, or for their fathers, but who really put out the case there that we've got to uphold these standards, and that's part of the expectation of being in the United States military.
Seth Moulton, Democrat from the great state of Massachusetts, Jim Banks, Indiana Republican, both on the task force for the future of the United States military. Gentlemen, there's a lot riding on this. We look forward to getting updates from you, and you know, best of luck in what's a very important endeavor. And thank you so much for taking so much time with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.